The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Dorothy poured her coffee into the same blue ceramic mug she'd used for 23 years. At 74, she had developed rituals that others might call lonely, but she called them perfectly peaceful. No one to rush her through breakfast, no one to interrupt her crossword puzzle, no one to judge her choice to eat ice cream for lunch if she felt like it. 3 months ago, Dorothy's best friend Helen had moved to Arizona to live with her daughter, leaving behind a gaping hole in what most people would call Dorothy's social circle. Her neighbor had clucked sympathetically, "Oh, you poor dear, you must be so lonely now." But as Dorothy sat in her quiet kitchen, she realized something surprising. She wasn't lonely at all. She was liberated. This wasn't the story she'd expected to tell about life after 70. Like most people, she'd always believed that aging meant clinging tighter to friendships, joining more social groups, and fighting against isolation. Society tells us that seniors need constant companionship to stay mentally sharp and emotionally healthy. But Dorothy was discovering a different truth about senior empowerment, one that challenged everything she thought she knew about growing older gracefully. Her journey toward independent living hadn't started with Helen's departure. It had begun 2 years earlier when Dorothy noticed how exhausting many of her friendships had become. Coffee dates filled with complaints about adult children, book club meetings that turn into gossip sessions, bridge games where the same old conflicts played out week after week. She found herself dreading social obligations that once brought her joy. The turning point came during a particularly draining lunch with her longtime friend group. As she listened to the familiar chorus of grievances about health problems, ungrateful relatives, and the changing world, Dorothy felt something shift inside her. She was tired of being everyone's emotional dumping ground. She was tired of pretending to care about drama that felt increasingly meaningless. Most importantly, she was tired of feeling guilty for wanting something different from her life after 60. That afternoon, Dorothy made a decision that surprised even her. She began saying no. No to the weekly complaint sessions disguised as lunch dates. No to the obligation to attend every funeral, birthday party, and social gathering. No to friendships that drained her energy instead of filling her cup. It wasn't cruelty. It was emotional wisdom hard-earned through 7 decades of living. What happened next defied everything the experts say about aging and social connection. Instead of becoming depressed or isolated, Dorothy felt more alive than she had in years. She rediscovered hobbies she'd abandoned to make time for social obligations. She traveled to places she'd always wanted to see, but never visited because her friends weren't interested. She developed a deeper relationship with herself, something she'd never had time for when she was constantly managing other people's needs and expectations. Dorothy's story isn't about becoming antisocial or bitter. It's about recognizing that the rules for friendship and social connection might be different when you're past 70. It's about understanding that sometimes the path to happiness lies not in accumulating more relationships, but in curating the ones that truly matter. It's about discovering that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. But Dorothy's revelation came with a price. Her family worried about her withdrawal from social activities. Her remaining friends felt rejected and confused. Even Dorothy herself sometimes wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. Was she becoming a hermit, or was she finally becoming herself? The answer would change everything she thought she knew about aging, friendship, and what it really means to live fully in your golden years. Hashtag Chapter 2. The weight of always being available. Dorothy hadn't always been someone who questioned the value of friendship. For 47 years of marriage, she and her husband Robert had been the couple everyone called first. Their phone rang constantly with friends seeking advice, needing a ride to the doctor, or simply wanting someone to listen to their troubles. Dorothy had worn this role like a badge of honor, believing that being needed meant being valued. After Robert's passing 5 years ago, Dorothy naturally assumed she would need her friends more than ever. The grief counselor had emphasized the importance of maintaining social connections during such a difficult transition. Don't isolate yourself. Everyone warned. Stay busy. Keep your calendar full. So Dorothy threw herself into being the perfect widow, gracious, social, always available for coffee or a chat. But life after retirement had revealed something unsettling about many of her longtime relationships. Without the natural boundaries that work and marriage had provided, Dorothy found herself becoming everyone's go-to person for emotional support. Her Tuesday was reserved for listening to Margaret complain about her son's divorce. Wednesdays meant enduring Patricia's detailed accounts of her various ailments. Thursday brought lunch with the book club, where actual book discussion had been replaced by a running commentary on whose grandchildren were disappointing them. The realization hit her gradually, like morning light slowly illuminating a familiar room. These weren't friendships built on mutual joy or shared interests anymore. They had become emotional transactions where Dorothy was always the one paying. She gave comfort, but rarely received it. She offered advice that was rarely taken. She listened to the same stories, the same complaints, the same fears week after week, year after year. Finding purpose in this new phase of life had become complicated. The volunteer work she'd once enjoyed felt obligatory when friends expected her to recruit them for every cause. The gardening club she'd loved became stressful when personality conflicts required her constant mediation. Even her beloved painting, something she'd rediscovered after Robert's death, was interrupted by friends who assumed she was always free to chat since she was just retired. Dorothy began to understand that senior reflection wasn't just about looking back on a life well lived. It was about examining which parts of that life still truly served her. The people-pleasing habits that had made her a devoted wife and mother weren't necessarily the same qualities that would help her thrive in her 70s. The emotional resilience she'd built over decades had been focused outward, supporting others through their crises. Now she wondered what would happen if she turned that same strength inward. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday when Dorothy sat in her car outside the community center, dreading another book club meeting. Inside, she knew the familiar cast of characters would be waiting, women who had somehow become more like emotional obligations than genuine companions. She could predict exactly how the next 2 hours would unfold. Surface-level discussion of a book half of them hadn't finished, followed by detailed complaints about adult children, health issues, and the general decline of modern society. As rain drummed against her windshield, Dorothy made a choice that surprised her. She turned the car around and drove home. For the first time in decades, she chose her own peace over social expectation. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, a tiny spark of relief that felt dangerously like freedom. That evening, her phone buzzed with concerned messages from book club members. Where was she? Was everything all right? Dorothy stared at the messages, realizing that their worry wasn't really about her well-being. It was about the disruption to their routine, the absence of their reliable audience. But what scared Dorothy most wasn't their reaction. It was how good it felt to disappoint them. #, Chapter 3, The Art of Rediscovery. The morning after her book club rebellion, Dorothy woke up without the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. For the first time in months, she didn't mentally rehearse her day around other people's needs and schedules. The silence in her house felt different, not empty, but spacious. She made her coffee and sat by the window, watching a cardinal build its nest in the oak tree Robert had planted 30 years ago. This quiet moment triggered a memory she hadn't visited in years. Before marriage, before children, before decades of putting everyone else first, Dorothy had been an art teacher. She'd spent her early 20s in a tiny studio apartment, painting until dawn and feeling completely alive in her solitude. Back then, she'd cherished her alone time, seeing it as essential fuel for her creativity rather than something to apologize for or fill with social obligations. Where had that woman gone? When had solitude become something to fear rather than celebrate? The transition into this new chapter of aging gracefully was forcing Dorothy to confront uncomfortable truths about the person she'd become versus the person she'd once been. Her marriage to Robert had been genuinely happy, but it had also required her to become someone more social, more accommodating. His job in sales meant their home was always full of colleagues and clients. Dorothy had adapted, becoming the perfect hostess, the charming wife who made everyone feel welcome. After his death, she'd assumed those social skills were just part of who she was now. But sitting in her peaceful kitchen, Dorothy realized she'd been wearing a costume for so long that she'd forgotten her authentic self underneath. The woman who had once spent entire weekends alone, painting and reading and thinking, had been buried under decades of dinner parties and social obligations. Her adult children, scattered across different states with busy lives of their own, had inadvertently reinforced this pattern. During their monthly phone calls, they always asked about her social activities. "Are you getting out enough, Mom? Are you staying connected?" Their concern came from love, but it also carried an assumption that her worth was measured by her social calendar. Nobody ever asked if she was happy spending time alone, if she was rediscovering interests she'd set aside, or if she was finally getting to know herself again. Senior reflection, Dorothy was learning, wasn't just about looking back with nostalgia. It was about excavating buried parts of yourself that still had life in them. The art supplies she'd moved to the basement after Robert's death weren't just gathering dust, they were waiting. The poetry books she'd loved in college, the hiking boots she'd worn before her knees started complaining, the piano she'd stopped playing when the grandchildren grew too old to sing along. All of these pieces of her authentic self were still there, patient and uncomplaining. But reclaiming these parts of herself meant disappointing people who had grown comfortable with the version of Dorothy who was always available, always agreeable, always putting their needs first. Her sister called that weekend, puzzled by reports from mutual friends about Dorothy's absence from various social events. "People are worried about you," her sister said carefully. "Maybe you should consider joining a senior center or taking up bridge again. You know, isolation isn't healthy at our age." Dorothy found herself bristling at the word isolation. She wasn't isolated, she was selective. She wasn't withdrawing from life. She was finally living it on her own terms. But explaining this felt impossible, especially to people who measured emotional well-being by social activity levels. That evening, Dorothy pulled her easel out of the basement for the first time in years. As she set up her paints, she felt something stir inside her that had been dormant for decades. It wasn't loneliness she'd been feeling all these months. It was hunger. Hunger for authentic expression, for uninterrupted time, for the luxury of following her own interests without explanation or apology. But as she lifted her brush to the canvas, her phone rang. Again, Dorothy stared at the screen, paint-loaded brush suspended in midair. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about it felt familiar. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Dorothy? This is going to sound strange, but this is Sarah Chun. From your art classes at Jefferson High? I was Sarah Williams back then." The brush slipped from Dorothy's fingers, leaving a streak of cerulean blue across her hardwood floor. Sarah Williams, the quiet girl in her third-period art class who had shown such raw talent that Dorothy had spent her own money buying her better supplies. The girl whose home life had been so chaotic that she'd often stayed after school just to keep painting, finding refuge in the art room when everywhere else felt unsafe. "Sarah," Dorothy whispered, sinking into her chair. "My goodness, how did you find me?" "I've been looking for you for 20 years." Sarah's voice was warm but emotional. "I'm an art curator now, living in Chicago. I've been working on an exhibition about teachers who changed students' lives. And Dorothy, I needed to find you. You saved me." The words hit Dorothy like a physical force. She remembered Sarah so clearly now. The way she'd held her pencil like it might disappear, how her face would transform when she was creating something beautiful. Dorothy had written countless recommendation letters for college scholarships, had even driven Sarah to art school interviews when her parents couldn't be bothered. "I tried to stay in touch after graduation," Sarah continued, "but you'd moved, and back then there was no internet to track people down. Dorothy, I need you to know something. Every success I've had, every piece I've curated, every young artist I've mentored, it all started in your classroom. You didn't just teach me art, you taught me that my voice mattered." Dorothy felt tears she hadn't expected. 30 years of wondering if her teaching had made any real difference suddenly answered in one phone call. This was rediscovery after 60 in a way she'd never imagined. not just finding herself again, but learning that the self she'd thought was forgotten had been living on in someone else's life all along. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice gaining excitement. "I'm curating a show called Full Circle. It features artwork by people over 60 who return to art after years away. Dorothy, I've seen your old paintings. I kept the small landscape you gave me senior year. I know you stopped painting when you got married, but if you're creating again, I'd love to include your work." The invitation hung in the air like a bridge between Dorothy's past and present selves. Here was an opportunity she'd never dared dream of. Not just new beginnings, but a chance to complete a circle that had been broken decades ago. Her art could matter again, not just to her, but to the world. But accepting would mean fully committing to this new version of herself, the one who disappointed book clubs and worried her family. It would mean admitting that all those years of prioritizing everyone else's needs over her own creative spirit had been a form of betrayal, not just to herself, but to the gift she'd been given. "I don't know if I'm good enough anymore," Dorothy admitted, looking at her easel with its blank canvas. "I haven't painted seriously in decades." "Dorothy," Sarah said gently, "you taught me that art isn't about being good enough for other people. It's about being honest enough for yourself. The exhibition opens in 6 months. Will you at least think about it?" After hanging up, Dorothy sat in the growing darkness of her living room, staring at her easel. Outside, the world continued its familiar rhythm, but inside her house, everything had shifted. The phone call hadn't just offered her an opportunity. It had revealed the true cost of all those years spent being who others needed her to be instead of who she was meant to become. The stakes weren't just about disappointing friends anymore. They were about honoring the teacher who had once believed that art could save lives and discovering whether that woman still existed inside her. Dorothy spent the next 3 days painting with an intensity she hadn't felt in decades. The blank canvas filled with colors that seemed to emerge from some deep, forgotten place inside her. She painted through meals, through phone calls she let go to voicemail, through the familiar guilt that whispered she was being selfish. But for the first time in years, the guilt felt smaller than the joy. On Thursday morning, as she stepped back to examine her work, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Helen standing on her porch, suitcase in hand. Her oldest friend had returned from Arizona unexpectedly, and Dorothy's heart lurched with a familiar mixture of affection and dread. "Surprise," Helen said when Dorothy opened the door, though her smile faltered as she took in Dorothy's paint-stained clothes and the easel visible behind her. "The desert wasn't for me. I'm back for good, and I thought we could pick up right where we left off." Dorothy invited her in, watching Helen's face as she surveyed the transformed living room. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, others half-complete. The coffee table was covered with sketches and color studies. The house hummed with creative energy that Helen had never seen before. "What is all this?" Helen asked, settling into her usual chair. "Are you taking some kind of art therapy class?" The question hit Dorothy like a slap. Art therapy, as if her rediscovered passion was some kind of medical treatment rather than the return of her authentic self. In that moment, Dorothy saw her oldest friendship with startling clarity. Helen had always been threatened by Dorothy's creative side, had always found subtle ways to diminish it, to redirect conversations back to safer, more familiar territory. "I'm preparing for an art exhibition," Dorothy said quietly. "A former student of mine invited me to show my work in Chicago." Helen's expression shifted through confusion, concern, and finally, disapproval. "Dorothy, that's wonderful that someone asked, but surely you're not seriously considering it? At our age, what will people think?" There it was, the question that had governed so much of Dorothy's life. What will people think? Dorothy realized that this was her life's turning point after 60, the moment when she would either choose the approval of others or the authenticity of herself. "Helen," Dorothy said, her voice steady, "I don't care what people think anymore." The words hung between them like a bridge burning. Helen's face crumpled, not with sadness, but with genuine bewilderment. "But Dorothy, we're supposed to be settling down at this age, not chasing impossible dreams. We're supposed to be realistic about our limitations." Dorothy felt something shift inside her, a deep recognition that had been building for months. This was wisdom with age, not the kind that came from accepting limitations, but the kind that came from finally understanding what truly mattered. She thought of Sarah, whose life had been changed by a teacher who refused to accept limitations. She thought of all the students she'd influenced, all the creativity she'd nurtured, all the dreams she'd helped come true. "Helen," Dorothy said gently, "what if our limitations are just stories we've been telling ourselves? What if the most realistic thing we can do is honor who we really are?" Helen stood up, shaking her head. "I don't know who you are anymore, Dorothy. This isn't the friend I've known for 40 years. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something in your own life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nkaf Wisdomy World. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom and stories matter. Join us every week as we explore life after 60, emotional strength, and the quiet power of aging with grace. Nkaf Wisdomy World, because every chapter after 60 still holds meaning.